My name is Haury, H-A-U-R-Y, last name H-A-R-R-Y, first name. So I am a election expert and a cybersecurity expert, and the three sentences for my resume, I suppose, is I consulted on HAVA with Paul DiGregorio, the head of the team that was authoring HAVA back in the period of 2000 to 2004. Obviously, it was passed in 2002, but there were things that occurred during that period of time. The reason for that was I'm a workflow expert, amongst other things. I was also working at the time as a contractor for the NSA, as an information assurance directorate member, consulting on cybersecurity, basically. So I was not only consulting with regard to the automation and what was possible with regard to election equipment, but advising on security measures that might be applied to make sure that things worked properly. The model that was followed for HAVA was the banking model for processing checks. So a lot of what you see in HAVA was written with that flavor in mind, how to make sure that the election process was run correctly. So I've worked for years with major organizations, mostly in the military and intelligence community, NSA, DITRA, CIA, Sandia National Laboratories. I've been involved in communication security projects from the public reaching integrated public alert and warning system, also called IPAWS, to which most people are familiar with indirectly, which is the system that's used to transmit Amber Alerts, but also other emergency notices on cell phones. I was the designer, one of two designers of that system. I've also worked with White House continuity of communication systems and the nuclear command and control system. So I've worked on very high security systems over the course of my career.
What can you tell me about the Help America Vote Act?
The Help America Vote Act had its history really in a couple of different places. One was the Bush versus Gore Supreme Court decision with regard to hanging chads, and there was essentially a senatorial compromise laid out between Democrats and Republicans post that decision to kind of heal the nation with regard to what happened in Florida and Broward County.
A big call to make. CNN announces that we call Florida in the Al Gore column.
Turn the lights down. The party just got wilder.
Florida goes to Mr. Bush.
Bush wins. Headline of the hour. Folks, it might be premature.
So we take Florida away from George W. Bush.
This is no longer an election. This is like Alice in Wonderland.
In the fall of 2002, Congress passed a sweeping reform bill, the Help America Vote Act, or HAVA.
For the very first time, the national government will step up to the plate and meet its constitutional duty to uphold the soundness and sanctity of the ballot in this country.
This bill would provide almost $4 billion, much of it to individual states, to replace old voting machines, train poll workers, and combat fraud.
The heart of the reform was a promise to improve voting machines, to make the machines work better.
As luck would have it, at the time, the largest user of large imaging systems were banks. The only people that were processing anything close to the volume that elections would require would be the large U.S. banks. I had a company at the time that had been incorporated into bank item processing, it's called, but the check processing at many of the largest firms in the country, including data processors that did it just as a business, like First Data Corporation, Bank of America, Citigroup, Fifth Third Bank, many others. I mean, we did 19 of the 25 largest systems. We also did item processing consulting for MasterCard, Visa, and American Express. That's the model that is embedded in HAVA. I had a lot to do with advising those that were drafting the legislation as to how to draft it.
So is it fair to say that you were called upon to help Mr. Gregorio draft HAVA?
That's correct. I was one of many, obviously, but I was instrumental in discussion about the cybersecurity aspects because I was already involved in cybersecurity issues and also the workflow automation and what the error rates were that were possible. There was tremendous concern that the errors associated with the hanging chads not be repeated if we started going to scanned images and that type of thing. So again, image processing of checks, even though it was relatively new at the time, even for banks, was by far the largest application of this type of technology. So actually the HAVA error standard was something that was derived basically from some assumptions and discussions with the government officials as well as what was possible with the technology in the banking context. And so the derived error rate that's actually written into HAVA was something that came from my work.
So a couple thoughts, and I'd like to get your comments on them. It seems like the stringent requirements that you would have in the banking industry as applied to imaging checks, making sure that there's a digital record, served as a anchoring point for the imaging of paper ballots.
That's correct. It's also the reason that the ballot transfer records, the chain of custody records and whatnot are built the way they are is a self-auditing function. It's designed to make sure that the totals at the end agree, that the number of ballots that came in agree with the count of ballots. And the way that this is self-auditing is similar to any kind of payment system or whatnot. You have the actual physical paper being able to be counted and then the result being able to be counted and seen whether they cross-foot correctly. So it's obviously a little different than a regular payment system, but the fact is that the reason that HAVA includes these auditable controls or auditable items as a legal requirement is associated with the banking industry, because what happens is you have this big tray of checks, or maybe even a whole cart full of hundreds of thousands of checks, and you have all these batch tickets associated with how many are in each bundle. The check processing system and the way that it was designed is the same way that HAVA was designed with regard to secondary controls to make sure that the processing was accurate. So,
one of the things that I've been observing in the election landscape is that there doesn't seem to be a stringent adherence to the standards imposed by HAVA. So before I touch on that, I want to ask you about just your observations of the banking industry. What is the tolerance for error rates with respect to financial transactions? So the tolerance is extremely low. You can imagine how people would be screaming if they had a 1 or 2% error rate in their checking account, right? So this issue is recognized as also being important because elections are one of the most important things that the United States does, is to maintain the democratic institution that guides our republic, which is the election of our officials. So they wanted to use a very stringent standard for the processing of ballots so that, and it's even worded in HAVA, so that there was no chance that the error rate of the operation would affect the outcome of the election, or a minimal chance, very, very remote chance. So the reason the standard's set as low as it is so that the operation, and remember, the system isn't just the machines, it's how the machines are used. So the system, can affect, if the machines are not used properly, you can drive the error rate up quite high. Or if you print your ballots wrong, you can drive the error rate up quite high. The machines might be perfectly capable of reading a properly registered ballot, as an example, but if they're all, 2/1000ths of an inch off and the registration doesn't read properly, the scan won't work. So the standard not only affects the machines, it's meant to affect the whole system of use. So basically what they wanted, the standard that was used in the incorporation of the original justification of HAVA, was that the only errors that should exist, only errors, would be the errors created by the users, the voters, when they mismarked a ballot.
That was the only error that was supposed to be tolerable in the system. So the handling of the ballots, the creation of the ballots in terms of printing and whatnot, the operational controls over what came in, and the actual processing of the ballots were supposed to be very, very intact, so that the error rates associated with that whole process were so low that they would never have, at least in the vision of the people at the time. And remember, in 2000, we were having some close elections, but we weren't having ones that were decided by 9 votes. But it was designed on purpose so that 9 votes might throw the system off, right? So the fact is, they set a very low error rate, just like the banks do, because it's intolerable to be throwing money around.
So what is the legally permissible error rate under the Help America Vote Act?
So it's interesting because it's interpreted 2 different ways, and it's because of the difference between, inversion of particular boxes versus reading ballots. So you can look at it as 1 in 125,000 or 1 in 500,000, depending on if you're talking about the transposition of individual votes or misreading the whole ballot. It works out the general guideline 1 in 500,000.
Okay, so that's actually a more conservative. So let me ask this again because
Sure.
I want to get this clarified. So out of the 2 numbers that you just gave me, which is the more stringent standard?
Actually, the 1 in 125,000 is more stringent because there are many positions on the ballot. So a ballot technically is invalid if anything on the ballot is read incorrectly. So if you have 10 positions on the ballot, any of the 10 being read wrong would invalidate that ballot in terms of processing the ballot electronically. Now, there is a process called adjudication that was designed to deal with, emergent conditions, right? Not really meant to deal with bad ballot registration, but, imprecise marking by the voter or whatnot. So those were supposed to not be read but adjudicated. So then there's a process of correction, but that's a different issue.
What I'm hearing you say is that the law is trying to accommodate 2 different things that are related.
Right.
One is looking at the entire ballot, just one ballot, versus individual races on the ballot. One of the challenges that or obstacles presented is I'm hearing judges say, well, we'd like to grant you relief, but if we take you at your word, candidate that's objecting to the administration of election, the number of votes that are in dispute would not make a difference in the outcome. That seems to be a very, very different analysis than what should be conducted under HAVA, given what you just mentioned, because we're talking about a minuscule number that's permissible under federal law. So I helped oversee an audit in 8 counties in New Mexico, and we pulled the risk limiting audit figures for errors going back to 2012. These were the numbers provided by the Secretary of State, and none of them complied with the error threshold that you just mentioned. And there was no correction to ensure that we had sounder processes. It seemed like that actually got worse from 2012 to 2014 to 2016. Let me ask you this, Harry. Based on your experience as a co-author of the Help America Vote Act, have you observed material compliance with the Act over the past 20 years? Yes or no?
Not at all. And the certifiers certify anyway. So, and this clearly under their affirmative duty under the law is not correct. You have to understand the premise behind elections, right? So there's a premise that starts all of this, which is the elections are supposed to be fully transparent and auditable. I mean, that's written into the law. And there are judges and observers that are part of that process because it's what's called in the art of cyber or operational security, it's called a zero trust model. I, as a Republican, don't have to trust what the Democrat says, and the Democrat doesn't have to trust what I say. So the issue is that the system itself is supposed to have this highly distributed model of trust and supposed to have basic factors designed into it. One is accuracy of the equipment. Another is certification of the equipment. Does the equipment actually work? Is it secure? Can you guarantee that it's doing what it's supposed to be doing, or is it subject to tampering? The operational security interleaves with the equipment and interleaves with the actual use of the equipment. So the system result isn't just the machine. A perfect example is your cell phone is completely secure if it's sitting inside of a Faraday bag. No one can hack it. No one can do anything to it, particularly if it's turned off. However, out in the wild, left on a table with the password already implemented, anybody could do anything to that cell phone. So you can have a relatively okay or secure device in certain use contexts, right? So if I'm in a restricted use context where no one can observe me putting in my password and I have it in my hand, that has one level of security. If I lay it on a table, leave the room with the password already input, it's a totally different set of security. Banks do the same thing. You don't put a stack of checks out on a cafeteria table and leave the room. Just don't do it. So election systems were designed the same way. You're supposed to lock up the ballots at night. The building's supposed to be secure. If it's not under eyes, in terms of guards observing it, it's supposed to be tightly locked up and reasonably under surveillance, right? So that you know whether somebody has gone in and tampered with the ballots. There's observation rules. Those observation rules are there's supposed to be judges and observers, and obviously it defies common sense. And the Supreme Court's even ruled on this in the 1800s, that if you have auditability and observability, they have to be effective. The case is called Coy, by the way. I think it was 1866 or something like that. I'm not sure of the date, but it was a long time ago. They had this issue even with paper ballots, that if you were going to have auditability or you're going to have observability, it had to be effective. You couldn't have a claim of doing that and not actually have it. So we've seen an interference by professional election officials for whatever reason with that observability. They're not putting people at tables. They're not letting people look through the windows. They're not letting people audit things because somehow that's going to tamper with the system. So there's another aspect of HAVA that you have to understand. It doesn't have to do with the error rate. It has to do with process integrity. Anytime you see an evidence, an accusation that there's a lack of process integrity, the OPSEC rules, Operation Security rules, say that certain things should happen. For instance, when a bag of ballots comes in, there's supposed to be, in most states, a sign-off by two parties that ballot bag was brought in. We have observation in 2020 and in 2022 of dropping ballots into the system without that kind of operational security control. In an operational security sense, that's called a total loss of control. You don't know what's in there. And the people in the systems that are supposed to double check and make sure that it's okay for that to be in there have been violated. People walking through the election equipment area with key fobs that are then plugged into a machine without some sort of controls associated with it means that you don't have adequate security controls. This is doubled down, actually, because there's really three laws that apply. There's the National Voter Registration Act, there's the Help America Vote Act, and now there's FISMA, which is Federal Information Security Management Act, that applies because it was declared as critical national infrastructure. So when they violate these operational security rules, it's assumed that you have no control over it at all. As a matter of fact, if you look at data breaches as an example, Because data breaches, you think of computer hacking, right? But a data breach can be anything. It can be somebody that's inside the place that's typing something that's not under control. They have passwords that they've been allowed to escalate privileges that they don't have authority to do. Or it can be a batch of ballots that's dropped in the middle of an organization without any controls associated with it. So as soon as these are observed, if there's any chance of materiality, the system, and by the way, the materiality is not the standard written in HAVA, but you could construe materiality to be relevant with regard to FISMA risk assessments, right? So if you bring in a bag of ballots with no control at all, none, from a provenance perspective, which is how the whole system is set up, is to maintain provenance on the ballots. If there's no control of provenance, there's no control of the vote. An example of this would be like Fulton County videos of people sorting ballots in the back, mail-in ballots in the back of a truck before they're delivered into the vote counting system. These things are if they can even exist at any kind of scale at all, again, it's called a total loss of control. Under normal operational security standards, the whole thing is thrown out. It's considered that the database itself is untrustworthy because you don't know what the size of penetration is. And there's a legal issue with regard, so you have to understand the structure of HAVA. It was always understood that taking this stuff to court was not the right thing to do. Even Bush was very reluctant in the Gore dispute in Broward County to trigger that at the Supreme Court level because they didn't want elections, particularly presidential elections, to be subject to litigation. They wanted it to be self-adjudicating. So there's a process in the election code that deals with this. It's highly distributed, but the officials are supposed to certify. But federal law on certification is quite clear. It's accurate and compliant. So and this again has been decided by the Supreme Court back in the 1800s.
Yeah, but let me stop you there because
Sure.
this is a huge frustration for me. That the only way that Bush's concerns are legitimate is if you've got trust in the institutions that are overseeing the processes. And to my knowledge, from William Barr and many people that were at the head of the Department of Justice, no investigations were done.
All right, sir. So tell us what the Jesse Morgan story is.
So Jesse Morgan's story is that he was hauling a semi-trailer from Bethpage, New York to Pennsylvania. He became aware as he picked up the semi-trailer that it was carrying Pennsylvania ballots. This is the story. So then, there were several discussions over time. Tony Schaefer and his people were handling the investigation originally. This other contractor took over the actual work at Bethpage to find corroborating witnesses, and they did. 3 other witnesses.
All right. Were you present when Mr. Schaefer received a phone call from a senior official of the Justice Department?
Yes, I was.
And was that, were you able to hear both sides of that conversation?
Yes, and about 6 or 7 other people were able to hear that conversation.
And so was it on the speakerphone?
Yes, it was.
And who was the who called who?
Bill Barr called Tony Schaefer.
The former Attorney General Bill Barr?
At that time, he was the Attorney General.
All right, sir. And tell us about that conversation.
It was relatively irate, and he was telling Tony Schaefer to stand down on this investigation. It was not a long call.
And what was the response to that directive from the Attorney General?
It was kind of ambiguous, but it was sufficiently strong to say that the evidence had already been found, and the response was, "I told you, you need to stand down on this."
And
the conversation was not long. It was agitated, to say the least.
And so one of the things that I'm curious about is, it seems like with all of the lawsuits that were filed related to 2020, virtually none of the legal theories were sounded under violations of HAVA and the other two acts that you just mentioned. And so in your expert opinion, whether it was the intention to go and litigate in the court system, when you've got something that is so functionally unsound, aren't we told that you have to take it through the court system?
Yes. So this is the dilemma, after all, right? So if you have a breach of control, even if it's a minor breach of control, the process of correction is explicit. It has to be investigated, measured, figured out if it could have been enough to have a material effect or not.
As a co-author of the Help America Vote Act, have you seen the lack of compliance increase over the years?
Absolutely. This, it became super serious in 2020, but there were problems even in 2016 that were observed, particularly in Georgia and Florida. But whether there were problems unobserved is a different question. But the fact of the matter is that the problems, it seems like there's a determination by the professional, I'll put that in quotes, the professional election officials, that that they're in control of all of this and that the law is somehow optional. Even CISA is cooperating with that by waiving requirements. There's no provision under the law for waiving requirements. From a practical administrative standpoint, maybe there has to be something like that, but that should be rectified in Congress. It shouldn't be rectified administratively.
Now, you mentioned two other regulatory structures other than HAVA. What was the second one?
The second one was the National Voter Registration, also called Motor Voter Act, okay. National, or NVRA, National Voter Registration Act.
So under the National Voter Registration Act, based on your expertise going back, someone who's monitoring election laws in tandem with HAVA, has there been material compliance with that act?
Not at all. There's a tremendous error rate in the voter registration rolls. I mean, the people that are looking at material compliance issues from New Mexico and Arizona to New York and Pennsylvania, they're all finding gross inaccuracies in the voter rolls. Now, the officials tend to wave their hands; those are just clerical errors. Well, the system doesn't allow clerical errors because the traditional method of injecting votes is with fake voter registration. So the reason the voter registration system is as it is to prevent the opening of slots where people can vote illegal ballots. Doesn't mean that they're doing it. That's a different issue, whether they are or they aren't. There's tremendous, evidence that they are doing that. But the fact of the matter is the secretaries of state generally are responsible, some states, different officials, but the fact of the matter is they're responsible for maintaining accurate voter rolls, and they say, well, we clean them up once every decade. That's not what was intended. I mean, in New York, as an example, I've worked with the New York Citizens Audit people, and they're finding error rates in the neighborhood of 10% of the voter rolls are apparently incorrect, illegal voter registrations. Now, does it mandate it would normally mandate law enforcement investigation, right? It's not up to citizens typically, unless you're running a key tam, to do the investigation for them. Or the election officials or somebody within the state government should be trying to figure out why there are all these audit entries. But instead what we see is this washing of hands of responsibility and saying, they're just clerical errors, they don't mean anything. That's not true. The trust system in HAVA, the trust system in NVRA, and the trust system in FISMA say you can't have those errors. You can't have them. And so, are there going to be errors? Obviously there are going to be errors. You can't help but have errors, but there's a system for correcting them and identifying individuals. I mean, there's numerous reports. Again, that doesn't make it something that's adjudicated, but But there are numerous reports of situations where people are waving through identity verification and adjudication stations. I mean, videos of people just hitting the button and not looking at it. So,
Harry, from my vantage point, though, it's almost like that was done by design. To give you the trappings of a robust system, yet there's no teeth.
HAVA is a civil rights legislation. It's not election legislation per se, it's civil rights legislation. The denial of civil rights under color of law, which is what's happening here, is a felony in the United States, but nobody is treating it like that. So, you know, but if you read the 2017 Justice Department guidance for prosecution, it's all in there. All these election violations that people are screaming about is in black letter explanation by the Justice Department in 2017, which has a long history. I mean, it cites the law that's associated with it. If you want to understand the complaints that were made were material and credible, and they were not investigated. So we have active interference by officials that didn't want to investigate it, either because they were against Trump or they were for Biden or whatnot in 2020. They were, you know, not wanting the Republicans to sweep the power in the Senate. I mean, I don't know what their motivations were. And ascribing motivations, or maybe it's just to divide the United States, because one set of people know that something's terribly wrong and the winners want to give it a pass, right? So,
okay. Well, there's one other regulatory set of laws. You said it was FISMA.
FISMA, Federal Information Security Management Act.
As a co-author of HAVA, it's your expert opinion that there's not been material compliance with that law since its inception. When you look at the voter roll or the motor voter laws that are out there, we don't have material compliance with the requirements that are there. And I can testify to the fact that across the country, when citizens are doing canvasses and comparing what they hear at the door with the official voter roll records, everything is just in disarray. But FISMA, in your expert opinion, are we seeing material compliance there?
Not at all. There's not a single FISMA risk assessment that's been done by any state that I'm aware of. Now, if somebody finds one, that's great, but to the degree that FISMA requires a risk assessment, which it does because of critical infrastructure designation, they have to hire the right people to look at the system. And it's not just the equipment. FISMA requires evaluation of the equipment within the context that it's being used and the risk associated with that equipment being abridged or hacked or you know, tampered with. I mean, it's not always hacking. I hate to use that word. It can be somebody that just wants to inject votes, and there's an easy way to inject votes. The control should limit those risks. So that's what it's called. It's the same as your audits. It's risk limiting controls. So the special, you know, the special rules for dealing with risk are all built into HAVA quite clearly. SB 800-53, I believe, but it clearly designates a risk evaluation having to be done by qualified individuals, and that's not being done anywhere in the country, which is just, you know, flagrantly ignoring the law. The law says you got to, you know, and CISA, you know, seems to be oblivious to their own legal requirements, and you know, they're not requiring that. But see, this is the problem. Our election integrity, is the result of the election important to the American people or not? And my postulation is that it is. I mean, it's important on both sides. And when we kind of devolve into this system where one side thinks they won and want to, you know, sweep it under the rug, and the other one wants to scream and yell about it, and you have this kind of division, you know, HAVA was meant to heal that kind of process after the year 2000 election. And it's, if anything, it's made it worse, because now there's these flagrant you know, situations that appear, and I mean, again, it has to be investigated and adjudicated, but the evidence seems to be propounding the idea that no one's paying attention to these rules at all.
Well, it seems like election officials, if we're going to give them the benefit of the doubt, are in a conundrum. Because on the one hand, they can say, look, we're not the regulatory bodies. I mean, we've got some regulatory responsibility to safeguard elections in our sphere. But they're in a tough position because public trust has been obliterated. And I think that's what you're hitting at with, if we're not going to have compliance to heal and bridge the gap. And one of the things that I'm seeing that's having a huge impact on us getting answers one way or the other on whether these machines can be subverted is a deprivation in providing this thing called a cast vote record. And I reviewed a NIST document that appears to suggest that it was intended for the public for this very, very issue, that you need to have an audible trail. And there's only a few things that are going to tell you whether or not these machines are functioning correctly. And the cast vote record's one of them. Right now, people are doing public records requests to get those cast vote records, and they're being uniformly denied.
Yeah, there's a few places that they've leaked out, but in general, so the conundrum that you're in, the created narrative is about destroying, two things: destroying the integrity of access to the right to vote, somehow disenfranchising people because of this interference. But in fact, what you're doing is disenfranchising the whole country, or at least half of the country, roughly half. Maybe more than half, maybe less than half. But the fact of the matter is, if you can't trust the system, you're disenfranchising everyone from a fair vote. So there's this kind of false narrative associated with the entry points, right? The have to have mail-in ballots. I'm not against mail-in ballots. I'm against systems that don't know who's voting. So the principle is, if you're going to do mail-in ballots, just as an example, you have to have a comprehensive system for identity resolution. It has to exist after the fact, which is non-existent. I mean, in Pennsylvania in 2020, they ordered hundreds of thousands of ballots to be counted that had not had any identity resolution done on them at all. Alito had ordered that they be held. And then at the end, because of political pressure over the situation, they went ahead and counted them anyway.
Well, it seems like, just observing what's going on with HAVA, if you're going to introduce machines into the process, post Bush versus Gore, that likewise you'd expect to have something that's meaningful in making sure that those black boxes are operating in a non-defective manner.
If you can't do a risk-limiting audit of the machines and the results and the entire process, entry to exit, if you can't do that, you can't comply with HAVA. HAVA requires the maintenance of auditability, and that infers that they are in fact auditable.
But wait a minute, Harry, there's lots of election workers out there that use the word risk-limiting audit all the time. In fact, they brag about
but
the number.
It's a zero trust system. I don't have to trust the election officials any more than I have to trust the other parties.
So in your expert opinion, does the quote-unquote risk-limiting audit that we hear about cover anything to do with how these black boxes operate?
Not at all. It's completely unresponsive.